Dr. Samuel T. Wilkinson is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, where he also serves as Medical Director of the Yale Depression Research Program. He received his bachelor's from BYU, where he majored in mechanical engineering, and worked in my molecular biology research lab. He then earned his MD from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and he completed a residency in psychiatry at Yale, where he is now on the faculty. His primary research focus is on depression and suicide prevention. His work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Wilkinson's research has been published in the best scientific journals, and he has also had articles featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He's been the recipient of many awards for his research, including having his work listed among the top 10 psychiatry papers by the New England Journal of Medicine. He has twice earned the Top Advancements and Breakthroughs Prize from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and he has received several other awards I won't list, including some specifically for his writing. Sam and his wife have 5 children and live in Southern Connecticut. He's here today to talk with us about some of the deep insights shared in his book called Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Sam Wilkinson.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a real honor to be back here at this campus. Let's see, can we get the slides up? There we go, okay. So these days, there's a lot of interest in artificial intelligence, AI. And the main way that I interface with AI is through my phone. And the main feature is by asking if I'm driving somewhere and I need to call someone. I'll say, Siri, please call so-and-so. I have a hands-free headset that I use while I'm driving. And if any of you have used this technology, you may have noticed that if you have more than one number listed for the same person, sometimes your phone may ask, which one? Meaning, which one do you want to call? So about 6 months ago, I'm driving in the car. I don't remember where I need to go. I have 2 of my kids in the back seat, ages 10 and 8. And I somehow, for some reason, I got in my mind, it'd be interesting to see if my phone can figure out who my wife is. I needed to call my wife. So instead of saying, call Sarah, I say, call my wife. Siri says, which one? Paul and Laura, I promise this is not a clumsy way to introduce my topic today. I wanted to share with you how I've been able to bring together what I have learned by study and also by faith. Now, if you'll allow me to be a little personal in my journey, I graduated from this wonderful institution some years ago, and within a few months of graduating, my wife and I got married. We moved to the East Coast, where I enrolled in medical school at Johns Hopkins. This is the iconic Johns Hopkins building, where in medical history it's an important building. Inside of this circular dome is where something called rounds started. That's a pattern of practicing medicine that goes on today. And I wonder, I don't know if anyone has been in here, maybe Allie has. Does anyone have any sense of what you see as you walk through these front doors? You see a picture of the sculpture of the Christus statue by Thorvaldsen. And I thought it was so neat when some 10 or so years after I started med school, that the church, under President Nelson's direction, adopted this honey, please be careful. I've heard that there's a car driving the wrong way on the freeway. And he says, honey, it's not just one car, it's hundreds of them. So obviously, he was the one going there. And I felt a little bit like this. And I spent a lot of time thinking and wrestling and praying and meditating and trying to figure out, do I really believe this? Is what I had been taught true? Does this go together with what I'm learning in the classroom? And after several months, in a way that's hard to describe, things seem to come together in a way that for me has been wonderfully fulfilling from both an academic as well as a spiritual perspective. And I want to share with you what I've learned a little bit since then. So when I say what I was learning in the classroom was at odds with the sense that I had that life has purpose and value and meaning, what I'm really talking about is this. This is Charles Darwin and a picture of his most famous book called The Origin of Species, in which he lays out the theory of evolution. It's an important theory in biology and life science and so forth. This is his most famous book. It was published in 1859. And for many people, not everyone, but for many people, since this time, evolution has been associated with the sense that there's no God, there's no purpose, everything's just random. One of my favorite examples of how evolution is somehow associated with atheism is the satirical news headline, "Atheists wait at table for Thanksgiving meal to evolve from nothing." Please don't tell anyone in the Northeast that I'm citing the Babylon Bee. I'll never hear the end of it. But there were some things that really I didn't get and I didn't understand. And I want to share a few of those things and hopefully impress upon you how, at least for me, things fell into place. Now, one of the first things I didn't like about evolution was this sense that life came into being through a totally random and haphazard process. And the reason that I concluded this was the case because some of the leading thinkers in this space explicitly stated such. Okay, this is a man named Stephen Jay Gould, a very influential biologist who worked and taught at Harvard for many years. And here's what he says in response to this question, why are we here? He says, "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that transformed into legs, because the earth never froze entirely during the Ice Age, because a small and tenuous species, that's us, has managed to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a, quote, higher answer, but none exists." Now, I think he's wrong in this, okay? And I'm going to try to lay out some of the reasons I think so. The second thing that I didn't like was what I thought evolution implied about human nature. If we are in some way the products of this process, what does that mean about? Are we ultimately just selfish and greedy and so forth? And again, the reason I thought this, I concluded this was because some of the leading thinkers explicitly stated such. So this is a book by a man named Richard Dawkins. He's probably one of the most outspoken atheists of our generation. A book published in the 1970s, probably his most famous book. And in the opening pages, he states with a fair bit of confidence, if you wish to build a good society in which people cooperate and interact generously with one another, you will get no help from biology because we are born selfish. Now that's a bitter pill to swallow, and I didn't quite like that. Well, again, I think it turns out that's not quite the full picture. I want to impress upon you in my remarks here a couple key principles. This is a lot to get through. I won't be able to go into all of these in detail, but the first is that evolution was not a totally random and haphazard process. Okay, this is in parentheses because I don't have time to get into all the details of it. The second is what I call the dual potential of human nature. The third is the existence of free will and how, when you combine these, this at least for me provides a framework to infer a purpose to our existence. And the fourth is why and how family relationships are so important to helping us fulfill this purpose. Okay. So again, I don't have time to get into all the details of this principle. Maybe we can talk another time. There are free copies of the book. Chapter 2 hopefully does a decent job of explaining this. Let me jump into human nature. Okay, what is at the root of human nature? Are we ultimately selfish or altruistic? This is a question that a lot of really smart people have been wrestling with for some time. Let me tell you two stories and see if they pull you in one direction or another, okay? This is a man named Jeff Skilling. Very smart individual, a businessman. He graduated near the top of his class at Harvard. After graduating from Harvard, he started working for a very prestigious consulting firm, and he was consulting to an energy company. After a few years, the energy company hired him directly, and he rose quickly through the ranks of this company, becoming one of its leaders. And his name and the company's name were in the headlines for all the right reasons. Very successful. But he was also a jerk. There's one anecdote of him leaving work in the parking garage, and he's racing around, cutting people off in the parking garage, all the while flipping them off. These are presumably people that work for him. Where he thought that human nature was primarily motivated by greed and fear, and he structured the culture of his corporation to reflect this. Not coincidentally, I think his favorite book was The Selfish Gene, which I showcased a few slides ago, in which he thought, again, selfishness is the ultimate in human nature. This is Jeff Skilling a few years ago, leaving federal prison. The company that he led was called Enron, and it collapsed kind of with breathtaking speed around the turn of the century. So, which way does this make us lean? Let me share another, maybe more uplifting story. This is a woman, Barbara Goodman, much less famous than Skilling. Around 2015, she started offering haircuts to homeless people. At first, it was just a few haircuts a month. Then she started also giving them to people leaving prison and offering them to women who are victims of domestic violence. And soon this started growing. She had to start a foundation to continue this growth. Which way does this make you lean in terms of, are we ultimately selfish or altruistic? Well, what does evolutionary psychology suggest about human nature? And if you're like me, when you think of evolution, you might think of this phrase, survival of the fittest. Now, there's problems with this phrase. Most biologists these days probably don't use it. They probably use natural selection. But I am going to use it because I think most people intuitively get what this means. And what I would submit is that if we're going to try to understand social nature, social traits of organisms, or of humans in particular, we need to turn this into a question and ask, survival of the fittest, what? Are we talking about a survival of the fittest individual or a survival of the fittest family or group? Let me try to demonstrate what I mean by this. And I'll use an example that originally was puzzling to Charles Darwin. It's a picture of honeybees. Just to refresh your memory, you have a honeybee hive, you have one female queen, you have a couple hundred male drones, and then you have 50 or so thousand female worker honeybees, all of which are incapable of reproduction. So these 50,000 worker honeybees, they work their entire lives, they cannot reproduce, they cannot have offspring and pass on their traits directly. So Darwin's puzzled, how if evolution is the way that nature creates, how would this have come about? So he realized, well, the bees must share their traits with their sister, the queen, and maybe indirectly their traits are passed on through her. So it's maybe not just a survival of the fittest honeybee, but a survival of the fittest honeybee hive. Let me share another example, maybe a little closer to home. This is a depiction of what are called the Auckland Islands, located about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. And in the 1860s, in the same year, there were two shipwrecks that occurred on opposite ends of this island. The first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. Now, fortunately, after about 18 months of a harrowing ordeal, all of the men from his crew survived. Now, the second ship was led by a man named George Delgarno. I couldn't find a picture of him. You might guess that he didn't fare quite so well, and that's the case. Unfortunately, most of the men from Delgarno's group died. So what was the key difference? The men from Musgrave's ship formed an incredibly cooperative and cohesive team. And this was epitomized in the first minutes even of the shipwreck, when Musgrave himself carried an injured man on his back as he swam through the waves to the safety of the shore. Now, I try to carry my 4-year-old in the pool on my back as I swim, and that's really hard. You can imagine how hard this must have been. Dalgarno's group, on the other hand, they'd had the opposite approach, and they took an every man for himself approach. And you saw this in the first day when they left an injured man behind to die on the beach as they searched further inland for food and other resources. So, in this case at least, it wasn't selfishness. It was the opposite. It was altruism and cooperation that led to a greater chance of survival. And I can at least imagine a lot of similar scenarios, maybe in our distant past, when it was a survival of the fittest group, not necessarily individual, that led to greater chances of survival. So, a survival of the fittest what? I love this phrase by two biologists who I think sum this up really well when they say, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. Okay. Now, we are taught and told to seek out of the best books wisdom. I hope they include journals, because this is in a journal. I feel like this is an eternal truth, not just in evolutionary psychology and group dynamics, group psychology. I feel like this is truth. So, let me try to impress upon you, it's not just selfishness and altruism, but things that we traditionally think of as good and evil, okay? So I want to ask for your inward participation a little bit, and I want you to think of someone in your life who epitomizes goodness. Okay, maybe a friend, a family member, and I want you to think of one word to describe that person, okay? So just for 1 second. And then we'll start over here, and we'll get everyone's, no, I'm just kidding, we don't have time for that, but think of one word, okay? So these are the words that I came up with: loving, unselfish, loyal, honest, brave, giving. I hope that most of your words would fall in line with that. Now let's do the opposite. I want you to think of a word that describes someone who epitomizes evil. Anyone got a word? All right, here's what I came up with: greedy, selfish, deceptive, manipulative, uncaring. Okay. Now, from an evolutionary framework, what I would submit is that almost everything on the left, at least in the flesh, came about through a survival of the fittest family or group. And everything on the right came about through a survival of the fittest individual. Okay? So, which is it? Which is it in human beings? Are we ultimately selfish or altruistic? Or another way to ask that question, was it a survival of the fittest individual or family or group? And I think you may know where I'm going with this, is that I think it was both. I think at different contexts in our ancient past, both of these levels predominated. And this has created within us what I refer to as the dual potential of human nature. We have immense capacity for altruism and cooperation, but also for selfishness, greed, and aggression, okay? And I like this because I think it helps us escape kind of the quagmire that social scientists and philosophers have been wrestling with for a long time. We have both of these capacities within us, okay? Now, if I were lecturing maybe at another place, I might start to dig into the evidence from neuroscience and psychology that I think is very compelling to demonstrate that free will is a real concept. We have this ability to choose. But this is BYU, and like most people, I would assume, most people believe that free will is a real thing. I know there's some smart people, a minority, who think this is an illusion. I think they're wrong, and the data, I think, is compelling for that. But I'm going to, for now, just posit this, that free will is a real thing. And when we combine these things that I'm talking about, the dual potential of human nature, plus the fact that we find ourselves with the ability to choose, I think this lays a compelling framework, at least, that life is a test, and that one of our purposes is to choose between the good and the evil inherent within us. Right? That seems, at least to me, written into our DNA. And it can't be a test unless we're pulled in one direction or another. That might sound familiar. All right, so just to review, I don't think evolution was random. I think there's compelling data to show an overall framework and direction to this. The way that nature has shaped us leaves us pulled in different directions. When you combine this with free will, to me this makes a very satisfying framework that life is a test. And finally, I want to spend the rest of the time impressing upon you why and how family relationships are so important to helping us achieve this purpose. But as I go into this, I want to ask two kind of related questions. One is, how do we build a good society? And the second is, what even is a good society? This is a tricky question to answer. Most of us have some sense of what a good society would entail. It would value principles of justice, equality, freedom. It would provide protection for the vulnerable. Now, the problem is that if we listed, say, 12 principles that are associated with a good society, and we ask 100 different people to list these principles in order of importance, we're going to get 100 different lists. Right? Much of the debate that underlies modern political polarization, much not all, has to do with differences of opinion as to the ordering of these principles. But I think this debate overlooks a more fundamental problem, which is that the darker propensities of human nature, selfishness, greed, aggression, and so forth, the darker propensities of human nature are at odds with communal well-being. Okay. Now, there are many intelligent and respectable people who disagree as to the ordering of these principles. But if there were a way to help people to choose altruism and cooperation over selfishness and greed, then building a good society is going to be easier even if we don't agree precisely with what that is. Okay. So, over the years, there have been many charismatic and visionary leaders who have tried to rework social rules in an effort to build a better society. This seemed to be a particular fad in the early mid-1800s. There were several dozen so-called experimental communities that sprung up around this time. Maybe it had something to do with the American spirit of independence being fresh in the public mind. I'll share just a little bit of detail of one such community. This is a man named John Humphrey Noyes. He started what later became known as the Oneida community. Noyes was a charismatic preacher. In some ways, his ideas were remarkably progressive in a good way. He helped start one of the first anti-slavery societies in the United States. He also advocated for a more egalitarian approach to a woman's role in society. But in other ways, his ideas were radical and bizarre and ultimately harmful. He thought, among other things, that he was not capable of sinning. That's not a good place to start. He attempted to drastically rework the way that societies were organized to build a utopia. And in so doing, one of the things that he tried to do was to dissolve the family unit. And his rationale was that by dissolving the family unit, the natural affection and love and loyalty that family members experience would be redirected at a higher communal level. So he essentially abolished monogamy, and he established what he called complex marriage. Women were allowed to have children, but they had to petition a committee to do so. This is purportedly a woman petitioning a committee to have a child. When children were born, they had to be reared communally apart from their biological parents. Again, this was done to try to dissolve the family unit and redirect the strong and biologically based forms of love that naturally occur in the family relationship at a higher communal level. This was met with a lot of dissatisfaction, especially among women. One woman wrote of how she would give in to the, quote, mother spirit that begets selfishness and idolatry by visiting her daughter more frequently than permitted. The daughter, later as an adult, wrote of how she would rush after her mother, flung myself upon her, clutching her around the knees, crying and begging her not to leave me until some leader came and take me away. Now this grates on it. This seems just wrong to try to dissolve these natural bonds of love and affection that are shared between family members, especially mothers and children. Noyes was a particularly charismatic guy, and he was able to keep this going at least while he was around. This lasted for a couple decades. But it didn't end well. He fled the community basically overnight, and within a week or so, this unique family structure that characterized the United Community dissolved, and people reverted back to essentially the biologically based forms of family with which we are familiar. Again, Noyes was not the only one who tried to have these weird experimental communities. There were lots of such communities. Most of them failed utterly within a year. And why did they do so? So many of them required their adherents to abandon the most natural and deepest forms of love and affection that people experience in the family relationships. Now, let's go back to this list. What I'm trying to argue here is that from a secular, worldly sense, in the flesh, the origin of these characteristics that we associate with goodness, they have their origin in the way that nature shaped family relationships. Nature shaped relationships between people within a group. And what is the most biologically relevant group? It's the family, okay? We are biologically primed to care and love for our family members more than any other relationship. This, I would submit, is how we are psychologically and evolutionarily engineered. It's a function of the way we were created. And societies that try to subvert these deepest forms of love and affection are not sustainable. By extension, societies that support and nurture family relationships will reap great communal benefits. And there's at least two ways that this happens. One is by improving outcomes for children, okay? There's a lot of data on this. I don't have time to go into all the data on this, but the best place for a child to be is being reared by his or her biological parents, who are married, by the way. I want to share a little bit more about how and why communities will reap communal benefits by supporting family relationships, because they will help men redirect their aggressive tendencies toward pro-social means. Now, as I've mentioned, my thinking and my conclusion is that the strongest forms of love and affection and so forth have their origin in the flesh in the way that nature shaped family relationships. By extension of this logic, it would stand that when adults are engaged in the rearing of their children, the better aspects of their nature will predominate. And it turns out that there's a large amount of sociological data to support this. Okay? Family life is nature's most powerful way of helping us choose our better selves. Okay? I think anyone who's had kids would agree that having kids is a crash course in how not to be selfish. Now, I want to spend a little time on how and why this is particularly relevant for men. I'm going to pick on men here a little bit. I hope that's all right. I'm going to do so because our most obvious social problems are mostly perpetrated by men. Compared to women, men are 5 times more likely to commit arson. They're 7 times more likely to steal, 10 times more likely to murder, 12 times more likely to be found in prison, and an astonishingly 88 times more likely to commit rape. So how do we help men to choose altruism instead of selfishness, to choose productivity instead of aggression? This is a complex question. There's not just one answer, but I think the most effective and helpful thing we can do is to help them become fathers. When men become fathers, they often experience a subtle but significant change in their nature. Fatherhood channels male energy toward pro-social means. Across cultures, becoming a father is associated with becoming less selfish and more socially responsible. All right, there's a quote by a man that I admire greatly about this. He says, "Fatherhood, more than any other male activity, helps men to become good men, more likely to obey the law, to be good citizens, to think about the needs of others. Put more abstractly, fatherhood bends male aggression toward pro-social purposes." This is by a man named David Blankenhorn, a book that I think is really important. It's a little dated now, but the principles still hold, called Fatherless America. Now, of course, it's more than just bearing children, okay? It's more than just conceiving a child. A man, in order for these positive aspects of fatherhood to be realized, a man needs to be engaged in the rearing of his children. But there's a problem, because compared to women, men have a fairly tenuous link to their children, a tenuous biological link to their children. I think for most of us, this is self-evident. A woman bears and carries an unborn child for 9 months. And it's only in the recent generation or two that bottle feeding has been an option. For most of our history as a human race, women were compelled to breastfeed, sometimes for several years. This created a fairly strong biological and emotional connection between a woman and her children. For men, it's a very tenuous link. Not to get into graphic detail, it's possible for a man to conceive a child and not even know it. This situation is absurd for a woman. You can't imagine a woman conceiving and bearing a child and not know. That just is not possible. So there is a real imbalance between men and women and the strength of biological and emotional ties to their children. And in order to offset this balance, there needs to be a strong cultural mechanism that helps link men to their children. And this is what I would submit is a really important but under-recognized purpose of marriage. Okay? Marriage functions in part to help link men to their biological children. And there's lots of ways it does this. One of the most obvious ones is by helping him, by having him live with the mother of those children. Okay. Marriage and fatherhood are closely linked. The quality of a man's marriage is a good predictor for the quality of his parenting. And some sociologists actually even refer to marriage and fatherhood as a, quote, package deal. Okay, they seem to be closely linked. Now, these days, men and boys are struggling. This is from the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago. Men are falling behind, they're aimless and isolated. This is another headline, boys and men in the US are struggling. The left should talk about it. This is the New Yorker, what's the matter with men? The Financial Times calls it the masculinity crisis. There's been lots of discussion about what to do about this problem. Much ink has been spilled, books have been written. These are some of them. Deaths of Despair is not only about men, but men, by and large, are those who suffer deaths of despair. Some of the solutions that have been offered are, well, boys should start kindergarten a year after girls because their brains mature slower. Other solutions are we need more male teachers in public schools so they can be good role models. Other potential solutions are we need more vocational training, and we need to get away from this idea that college degree is the only way to success, and we need more economic opportunities and so forth. And there's probably something to be said for all of these potential solutions. But if we are not talking about fatherhood and marriage, I think we're missing the mark. And the reason I say this is because I think from an evolutionary perspective, there is no powerful motivating force than to provide and care for your biological offspring. I'll end with a story of, there's a man named Charles Ballard, who was a social worker in the inner city neighborhoods of Cleveland in the 1980s and 90s. Now, Ballard started what was called the National Institute for Responsible Fatherhood. His whole goal was to help young, unwed fathers who were somewhat distanced from their children. Now, traditional thinking is that in order to help these types of men, you need to first provide them economic security and opportunity, and then you can help them be better fathers. But Ballard flipped this logic on its head, and he spent most of his effort and time linking them emotionally and socially, supervising visits, giving parenting classes, and so forth. Over a course of about 10 years, he helped 2,000 young men reconnect with their fathers, with their children. When they entered the program, about 12% of them had full-time employment. When they finished, about 62% had full-time employment, and the vast majority, 95%, were contributing in some way to the financial well-being of their children. I think this is in line with what psychologists have known for a long time, which is that intrinsic motivation is more powerful than extrinsic motivation. And from an evolutionary perspective, in my mind at least, for a man, there is nothing more powerfully motivating than the duty to care for and protect and provide for your own biological offspring. I think that is a function of the way that we've been created. Now, this is a wonderful initiative that Ballard led. I think more government and community programs should take note of the motivating force that comes when men are linked with their children. But these programs are quite expensive, and at least my enthusiasm for this program is tempered somewhat when I recognize that all of this initiative is trying to replace the role that marriage has served for centuries, which is to link men to their biological children. So, if we're talking about trying to create the good society and to help people choose the better aspects of their nature, I think that marriage and fatherhood are critical to this discussion. Just to recap, evolution was not a totally random and haphazard process. The way that nature shaped us leaves us pulled in different directions. We have vast capacities for good, but also evil. When we combine this with free will, to me, this provides a framework wherein one of the purposes of our existence is to choose between the good and the evil within us. And this is why and how family relationships are so important to helping us achieve this purpose. Now, I still have a lot of questions about science and faith, in particular about evolution. What about Adam? What about the fall? I hope to continue to write, to research, to think, and maybe I have a little bit of the genesis of answers to these questions. But for me at this point, this has been an immensely satisfying framework to bring together into a unifying framework what I have learned by study and also by faith. Thank you for your interest.
So, Laura, did you have some questions for Sam as we get started here?
One thing I've been thinking about has to do with the case you make that, there's a great power in groups, right? And so much positive aspects of human nature come from these group dynamics and these groups we develop. But hand in hand with that goes the human tendency to see others outside the group as the enemy. Yeah. And I see that in our culture and around us where there's a human tendency to say, these are my people and these are the enemy. Yeah. And it's really harmful in our society. What have you learned through your research and in your thinking? What are the ways that we can kind of conquer that or raise the whole society to a level where we can see each other as all in the same group?
That's a really good question. The technical terms that you're getting at are what are called in-group and out-group bias. And that's what is known as in psychology. And we do have this tendency to, in our mind, form groups. And we treat those inside the group preferentially, and those outside the group, we treat less well. This is a tricky thing about human nature. One of the interesting things about it is that what the definition of a group is quite flexible, and we can continue to draw the boundaries larger and larger until hopefully they encompass everyone. I think that it's a profound teaching that I am a child of God. This is what we teach our primary children, but teaching people that they are children of God and that everyone else is as well is I don't know that there's a more effective way to do it. There's a story that I love from a man, I didn't know him, but I knew of him, named Bruce Porter. I think he was a general authority. He was studying at Harvard I think it must have been the 70s. And he had been asked in the summer to help teach primary. Back in those days, I think primary was held on a weeknight. And at first, I think he said he was hesitant. He's really busy, and he's solving all the world's problems by these lectures at Harvard and studying. And he was kind of taking his time, grudgingly walking across the campus to the church building, which is very close to the Harvard campus. And as he got to the door, he heard he heard a song that he hadn't heard, which was "As I've Loved You." The children were singing "As I've Loved You," and he later shared how it just stunned him that he had walked to the campus thinking, "Oh, I'm missing out on all these lectures and important discussions trying to solve the world's problems, and I'm looking at the solution to the world's problems, which is teaching children to love one another as I have loved you." So
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And the rest of the story is that his widow is now our general primary president.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I want to back up just a little bit on the issues around the level of natural selection.
Yep.
Right. So, because I think that this is an important theoretical and biological point in the book that, my understanding is that there's been a lot of ink spilled and maybe a lot of tenured positions lost over these different debates about at what level does natural selection take place?
Yeah.
Is it the gene? Is it the cell? Is it the individual? And I think if people could understand the complexity, and why is that a controversial argument? Because group selection, as I understand it, is still somewhat controversial.
Yeah. So group selection is controversial. It came about, I want to say, the 60s and 70s, and at that point, it was dismissed with almost like a religious zeal. It has since kind of had a resurgence through the painstaking efforts of, among other people, a man named David Sloan Wilson. It still remains somewhat controversial. Most folks who are kind of based more in social science, they tend to believe it more. Those who are more in kind of biological science tend to believe it less. What's not controversial is kin selection, which is some biologists might not like this, but you could conceptualize in part kin selection as, well, it's group selection at a family level, right? So that's not controversial. And but among the social scientists, there's growing acceptance of group selection, especially when the mechanism is less biological and more cultural. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm one of these. It's probably all of them. Genes, cells, different contexts. I don't think it's limited to just one. And theoretically, it could be a lot of different levels.
And they call that multi-level.
Multi-level selection.
Selection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Did you have another question here? Or should we get to some of
I have
these?
questions from students and audience
Great.
members.
Yeah, why don't we
those.
get to some of those?
Okay. A student here asked a question that has to do with your book, but also your expertise as a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
If the journey of discipleship is about choosing good within oneself, what tools would you offer to avoid falling into unhealthy perfectionism and self-criticism?
That's a good question. There's a school of psychotherapy that's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and this was developed in the 1950s. And since that time, evidence has grown and grown. It's very helpful. Cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, there's a variety of versions. Those techniques, and you don't necessarily have to have a therapist to do them. If someone who's motivated, they can buy a book and go through the techniques themselves. Those can be really helpful to avoid, self-criticism, self-blame, unrealistic expectations and ideals and so forth. It's a balance, right? I mean, we want to strive to be better, but when we are beating ourselves up all the time, that's not helpful. So CBT, and if you want, you can send me an email. I can send you a number of books that I can recommend.
Okay. So. We have a question here from Jonathan Pike, who's at Wheatley Institute here. Can you explain this statement more? Selfishness beats altruism within groups. In the long run, because of accountability that extends beyond our lives, in both the temporal and spiritual sense, I only see altruism winning.
I would agree. And I think that's the that's the trick. That's part of the test of mortality, is that we can't always see beyond that, and we think, oh, maybe I get ahead by cheating or being dishonest, and we all are sometimes tempted by that and have that capacity. But yeah, in the long run, I think altruism wins out, but there's a kind of a battle going on.
But a short-term gain. I think what's implied by that statement you had is that there's a short-termism.
Yeah, but it doesn't end well. Like
Yeah.
Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay, overall, what's the kind of trite, but if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah. Do you want to choose another question here?
Sure. A student, a student has asked, was intelligence the number one reason that Homo sapiens outcompeted all other human species? And if it wasn't intelligence, what other evolutionary factors contributed?
That's a complex question. I don't know that I have a great answer, but our ability to cooperate is definitely very high. But again, no other species kind of commits mass murder to the same degree that we do. Intelligence is part of that, or ability to cooperate. Certainly, language. In so many of these things, you see kind of a glimpse of them in other creatures, but it's much more developed in human beings. So I don't know that I could say it's just the secret sauce is one thing or the other. But certainly, intelligence is very important. The ability to communicate, language, and so forth.
I had a question, and I got a little sense of this in your discussion today, but you look a lot at the social science of why we see such a huge marriage premium. That is, those that are married enjoy greater health, greater wealth. I mean, there are just all sorts of benefits that we see in the social science on this. And so your definition of a good society, if I understand it, is one that encourages marriage and that kind of coupling. Do we get that?
Promiscuity, right? And certainly, again, we have that capacity, but I won't go into all the details now, but there's a lot of evidence that, oh no, at some point, and this has to do with, in part, with the the incredible immaturity of our offspring. When they're born, they're totally helpless and dependent upon their parents. And so it seems that there was a point, another era, where a man, it wasn't just, the more children a man had, the better, but a man had to also be involved in rearing those children so that he could become a grandfather and so forth. So I think in a very real way, we are pulled in both of those directions. So yeah, marriage is critical. Anyone who's been married knows that in order to have a successful marriage, there's a party that you have to push to the side and not listen to and say, I'm not, I can't be selfish. I can't be aggressive, certainly can't be promiscuous. So there's a certain party that you have to turn off, or, the scriptures refer to that as the natural man. So, it's a struggle sometimes, but marriage, the ideals that it upholds and the ways that it links a man to his biological children, I think are I don't know that you can build a good society, a utopia, without that.
Okay.
Based on the way that these we're pulled in these different directions.
Do you have another question? Or,
Do we have time?
Oh, we do.
We
We
keep
do.
going.
We can keep going for a few minutes here.
There's a question here about how your research, actually whether your research into evolution and evolutionary psychology has impacted your research into depression and other mental illnesses. Are these separate pursuits for you, or do they inform each other?
Well, no, they're definitely linked. Certainly, I spent a lot of time thinking about, why do people get depressed? Why do they? How can we help them climb out of that hole? Why do they get depressed in the first place? But also, what does it give people a sense of purpose and meaning? And they're related. We are struggling. We're in the midst, many would agree, we're in the midst of a mental health crisis. And a lot of people will say, well, we need better systems of care. And there's certainly something to be said for that. But at the same time, and there are many forms of depression that respond well to medicine and therapy and so forth. But at the same time, there have never been more people on antidepressants than there are now. I think there's a form of depression that stems from loneliness and that stems from the atomization of society that has been occurring with reduced marriage rates, reduced religious attendance and observation that is related to this. So certainly I spend a lot of my time thinking, how can we make therapies better? But we're not going to make everyone happy and solve all the world's problems with Prozac. I'll be the first to admit that.
Kind of a follow-up, if in a way, on this, because thinking about the importance of groups and so on in this whole question around loneliness and depression. A student asks here, what is the best size for groups to be effective and not feel lonely despite being part of a group? Is there anything that in your psychology or in evolution that says something about group size?
Yeah, they definitely can get too big, and it's not exactly answering that question, but there's a concept called Dunbar's number, which is essentially kind of the number of people that you can have a conversation with, and then a week go by, and then you kind of remember what conversation you were having, and that's about 150. And I think, I think there's a good reason that the Lord keeps our wards around the size that they are. If they get too big, people start to get lost. And certainly family size. I don't think even in a family with several children that there's this risk that you're going to get lost or not noticed. Certainly your parents are going to notice you. So I don't know that I have a great answer to that question, but Dunbar's number is something to look into, which is about 150.
Okay. Should we take a couple more questions? Two more?
Okay. Here's a question about free will.
Okay.
In your position, free will exists.
Yep.
This student says, no decision is made in a vacuum. There are always external and internal factors guiding our decisions. Is this determinism?
I don't think so. So it's definitely not clear. The jury is still out on whether the world in which we live is deterministic or not. There's compelling data even from animals where you put an animal like a microscopic nematode worm, you put it in, as much as possible, you control the exact same conditions, and in different scenarios it will behave in different ways. So behavior, as far as we can tell, even at relatively rudimentary levels, is not deterministic. Now, the purist philosopher might say, well, you can never conclude a system is deterministic or not. It appears that way or it doesn't appear that way. But as far as we can tell, even at fundamental levels, behavior does not seem to be deterministic. I think that's now. To get into the philosophy, there are a number of philosophers who say, well, free will is not really related to. You can have free will even in a deterministic society or system. That's called compatibilism. I've thought long and hard about that. That still doesn't really make sense in my mind, but there are a number of philosophers, probably most philosophers, who say, I'm a compatibilist, I believe in free will, even if the world is deterministic. So, but I disagree. So.
Okay.
Another question here, final one we'll ask, and then we do hope you'll join us for the reception afterwards, and you can have an opportunity to ask additional questions. For those who aren't married, what things can we do from an evolutionary standpoint to become selfless now?
I think probably one of the biggest drivers, in my opinion, the data that I'm familiar with, is and this is not going to be a huge surprise or insight for this group, but being a part of a group that is bigger than yourself. And in many instances, this is religious participation, serving in some community organization. But and altruism is rewarding, right? We go around with a number of cognitive illusions in our minds, meaning that we're not very good at predicting what brings happiness and reward and so forth. We think that we tend to think that if I had a better car, a bigger house, more money, that I'd be happier. But the data are pretty consistent that might work for maybe a couple weeks, but you go kind of back to your set point. But relationships and being a part of something that is bigger than yourself, I think is going to, one, make you happier, and two, help you to kind of shed what we call the scriptures call the natural man.
Well, we've had just a great hour with you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming back. Please join me in thanking Professor Samuel Wilkinson.
Thank you.